bad noise. Go ahead.
Thank you. And I will echo the call for comments or questions in the chat box, because it looks like we're going to have plenty of time. And it would be great to get a little bit more transportation flavor through this in terms of confirming or denying or expanding on some of the trends and practices that we're going to talk briefly about in this presentation. So this is a summary document that is on the website. It's a technical memo that is available on the website that Adam just showed you. And it really is, the idea here is to try to put transportation in the larger context of overall workforce trends. So I'm not seeing the slideshow all of a sudden, Adam. I'm not quite sure what happened there.
My bad, Pat. It'll be right back up.
Okay, well, I'll just start chatting. So what we did is we looked at trends overall in the workforce, particularly over the last couple of years. There have been some significant shifts in trends around the pandemic. And the themes associated with those trends really kind of coalesced around three areas. And those are workforce or worker availability. And certainly I think that my guess is, as you put your words in the challenges for the word cloud that we'll see later, I'm pretty sure everybody's experiencing some of that, some of the problems with workforce or worker availability. Secondly, the knowledge, skills, and abilities that we need for TISMO in particular echo those that are seen in the workforce in general because of the movement into a stronger technology focus, more of a knowledge-based industry, and a variety of other things. Even I was joking with a friend the other day as we were waiting for service in a restaurant, and it didn't seem like even folks who are doing restaurant work are familiar with the skills and abilities associated with that job. So I think people are doing a lot of shuffling around, and there's a lot of new employees in new positions. And so knowledge, skills, and abilities, the issues and limitations with those really permeate across all industries. And then the third is worker expectations. So we will look at each one of these in a little bit more detail. And I don't think I have slide control, so I'll let Adam run the slides. So worker availability is a significant issue. During the pandemic, the unemployment rate was extremely high, and it came down in December to 3.9. Over the last 2 months, it's been 3.6 unemployment. So it is extremely difficult to find and recruit new hires. And the other residual impact of COVID that is causing some of this worker availability issue is a lot of rethinking. We've all heard about the Great Resignation. And part of what that really meant was people were reassessing their life situations, and they were experiencing challenges in lack of daycare, childcare, shifting priorities as they really had the time over the last few years to reassess what was important to them and where they wanted to spend their time. And then there's also been a significant shift in or expansion in people who want to change fields or occupations, go back to school, get additional training, try something new because what they were doing before did not meet those shifting priorities. So it's been a really interesting residual effect from the whole pandemic and reshuffling of the workforce. So due to that, we have a lot of competition for employees between industries with this low unemployment, and particularly in areas where there are limited knowledge, skills, and abilities like technology-related fields, and TISMO certainly falls under that. And then finally, wage and benefit expectations. We've certainly all heard in the news about the increased wages, increased demands for wages, and that's certainly having an impact on our ability to hire the folks we want to hire. So next slide. So in terms of knowledge, skills, and ability, one of the things that's also impacting TSMO in particular is the need for additional skills. So when Adam was going through the 19 job descriptions that are in the guidebook, a lot of those are emerging. A lot of those are really looking at new skills and KSAs that really have not traditionally been within the transportation engineering world. So there's certainly, that's happening in TSMO. It's happening in other industries as well as they become more technologically oriented. So we need, and so does everyone else, needs to expand where we're looking for and recruiting from. And those really need to include what we call non-traditional sources or places we haven't looked before, really. And so it's certainly beyond the civil engineering world and looking at a variety of additional sources that we haven't really considered or haven't really gone for in the past. Also, training skill development within our own workforce, within the TSMO workforce, and across the workforce in general to really create the skills we need. And then another trend that we saw, and looking at the literature and the current trends, is this movement from a traditional roles-based hiring and recruitment process to more of a skills application. So the skills can cut across a variety of roles and jobs and really start to change the ability of the organization overall. So shifting from job descriptions to skill-based hiring, I think, is a significant trend that we all need to be aware of and start to work in, particularly with this emerging, growing field of TSMO. So next slide. And then the third sort of category of trends that we looked at were worker expectations. And for those of you in HR or those of you who have tried to hire recently, you know that the worker expectations have evolved and recently changed really quite significantly. And there's a real trend toward increasing flexibility, whether that's schedules, time of day work, length of day work, and then also the whole idea of remote and hybrid work. That's not going away after the pandemic. It may certainly, a lot of people may go back to the office, or those who have to be physically in the field, those certainly will do that. But there's going to be this hybrid model that I think is going to really be a significant trend moving forward. The other thing that workers are expecting, particularly the younger generation, the Gen Zs, are really looking at what do you have in terms of opportunities to use my technology skills. These workers have grown up within a very strong technology environment. They want to use those skills. They want to expand those skills. And so they're looking for what technology do you use to make the job more interesting and less routine. And so there's a lot of emphasis on that. There's also a lot of emphasis on social purpose. And over the weekend, it was interesting. I saw a recruiting ad for Boeing online in one of the newspapers. And the headline said, "Find your purpose at Boeing." And that is a definite trend across industries that we really need to be looking at how we can help with social purpose. Work-life balance is a significant expectation that folks need to be able to deal with family, charitable organizations, whatever else is important to them, and then always pay and benefits. So moving to the next slide. There are a couple other emerging models and trends that are worth noting, and those are the gig economy that includes what we're very familiar with in terms of Uber and Lyft. Amazon Flex allows drivers to be a delivery arm of Amazon. Fleeting is an interesting online application that connects truckers, shippers, and other transport users, so that the truckers themselves become entrepreneurial and can be more flexible in their schedule, not have to work with other people's requirements, and they can pick and choose like any other gig economy how they work. And the final one, Appen, is an AI development crowdsourcing tool that allows online contractors to help develop AI. And the other model or trend that's emerging significantly is AI and machine learning. And this is something that can really help to shift the workers' emphasis from repetitive, simple activities to more of a strategic problem solving, allowing the AI to do the more repetitive actions. So these are things that we all need to be aware of as we're looking at recruiting, retaining, and expanding our workforce. So what we did, looking at the next slide, we looked at a number of other industries, and we did this in advance of the summit last fall. And so we sort of looked at that in the context of these models and trends. Adam, I'm on the next slide. Thank you. And we looked at water, we looked at information technology, and we looked at trucking, because there were some similarities across each of these with what we're looking at in terms of TSMO. So going to the next slide on water, one of the tools that's out there that was developed by EPA is an initiative called America's Water Sector Workforce Initiative. And what they did is they looked at workforce needs within the water industry. And one of the things that really aligns with TSMO is the importance of sustaining the water infrastructure and the water infrastructure investment. How important that is to society as a whole. It's right along the same lines as our transportation infrastructure. And one of the things that they are finding is that one of the most meaningful ways to start to build that workforce and bring people into the water area is to really create water as a career of choice. And that is something that we've talked about within the transportation industry. And as you can see, even Boeing is doing that within their industry. So creating water as a career of choice, creating TSMO as a career of choice, starting to look at what the workers' expectations are and what's important to them, I think can really start to we can take some of the ideas within the water initiative, because one of the things that's most important about the water industry is that it's also using a lot of sophisticated information management systems to monitor the quality and the treatment and the processing of drinking water, similar to what we're doing within managing and operating our transportation infrastructure. So the next slide, we're looking at the IT environment. Work that was done there that we looked at was done again at the federal level by the chief information officers. They published an update called the Future of the Federal IT Workforce Update that looked at innovation, mobility, cybersecurity, collaboration, and agility around the issues of very similar to what we're looking at: recruitment, retention, reskilling, augmentation, and measuring. So going to the next slide, the information technology, they developed several recommendations and actions to take. So these next two slides really just summarize those very quickly. They looked at the issues of the pay system. They looked at moving to competency-based classification. And the other thing that is interesting is that the pay system that they looked at was trying to develop a government-wide pay system, which is interesting, and especially if you start looking at it from a skills-based perspective. They were looking also at interdisciplinary procurement teams, which I think has always been an interesting challenge within ITS and TISMO in particular. They looked at redesigning IT recruiting and rehiring processes to increase diversity and quality. And then they also tried to make the career paths more clearly defined and more attractive to the workforce. And then the next slide, the remaining recommendations that came out of that were to look at really who are the best performers and innovators within the system, compare the effectiveness of the IT workforce with the private sector, which is always a challenge, particularly around pay and benefits scales, expanding pilot programs and looking at new recruiting practices within that, and adopting long-term impact of augmentation offerings. And then they also looked at employing additional SMEs who were trained as project managers. So you had subject matter experts who had specific training and capabilities around project management. So within, going to the next slide, we'll just briefly go through some of the challenges associated or that we found within the trucking industry, because particularly when we're looking both at the professional and paraprofessional, I think we can learn some things from trucking in particular that may apply more to some of the paraprofessionals that we are looking to recruit and retain within our industry. So they have some particular challenges that are similar, I think, to everyone across the industry, but theirs are, I just think, probably more extreme in terms of turnover rate. They are also, as everyone else is, dealing with an aging employee base with baby boomers retiring out of the workforce. They have significant issues and limitations with wages. And one of the real challenges that they found, particularly through the pandemic, is the ability for commercial driver's licenses that have been held up through some of the limitations in some of the testing and training opportunities that were in place before. So those and then the need to really support new drivers through mentoring and apprenticeships were identified as some of the significant challenges. So what they have, some of the recommendations that have come out of their issues are developing and launching apprenticeship programs, addressing safety issues in terms of advancing safety equipment within their trucks, and then providing additional safety analytics and any other kind of technology that might start to, as we mentioned before, entice and engage some of the younger workforce members that are more comfortable with having some additional technology support. The other issue that we looked at on the next slide is we looked at issues associated with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that will be one of our breakout groups today. We will be talking in a lot more detail with you there, but we wanted to just sort of give a brief overview of what we found in terms of some of the DEI issues. And what we really found was that, first of all, an understanding, particularly at the leadership level, of the opportunities that diversity provides to an organization. And there are a number of studies that are out there that indicate that organizations are more successful with a more diverse representation in their workforce, a variety of perspectives, skills, and abilities, and that it really creates not only in terms of skill sets, but also collaboration, focus, perspectives, and in the private sector, it actually increases profit margins, which is an interesting perspective that I think that people may not necessarily make that equation initially without really looking at some of the data and information that's out there. And obviously increases innovation and productivity with a more inclusive and equitable environment. So some of the other issues that are certainly a focus within this area are retaining women in the workplace, and also noting the intersectionality of some of the issues around, for example, Black women who are not only challenged by the issues associated with gender, but they're also challenged by the issues associated with racism in the workplace. So really looking at a wide variety of the challenges associated with gender, race, and other physical or limitations of any variety that really need to be addressed from an organizational cultural perspective is really important to increasing productivity and effectiveness of the organization. So a couple interesting efforts that are going on the next slide. ITS America has initiated an effort called Mobility XX to increase the percentage or participation of women in the transportation workforce. At this point, they're saying that women comprise only 15% of transportation workforce. I don't know, I'd have to dig a little deeper. I don't know exactly who they have included when they define transport workforce, but they have committed to provide support for expanding that over the next few years to create a more diverse workforce with a greater percentage of women for the purpose of increasing a safer, more equitable transportation environment and transportation options for women and society in general. The NetInt Transportation Institute did an interesting study where they, and this goes back again to that choice of career issue, and they looked at framing transportation in a pro-environmental perspective. So they added a 1-day, 1-module transportation class to a climate change course that was going on at the university. And from that, they got an increased interest in transportation careers. As you can see, the statistics there, it more than doubled. So it was really interesting when some of the younger generation sees the relationship between a green and sustainable career with transportation. It really starts to make it a greater choice opportunity for them. And then the next slide, we had looked previously at accounting, particularly a development or a toolbox that they created called the Recruitment and Retention Toolkit that looked at diversity within accounting to try to create a more diverse and inclusive environment and workforce within the accounting world. And they noted a few things of importance that I think translate well into TISMO. One is the role of leadership in terms of how they promote and create a culture of diversity within their industry, and that is extremely important in terms of how that rolls out to the rest of the organization. The importance of diversity in the profession. And then the toolkit specifically looks at tools to attract, recruit, and retain a diverse workforce. And they have suggested that each organization create a diversity recruiting plan that they can follow to help them stay conscious of and really work to obtain a more diverse workforce. And then similarly, once you've recruited, you need to create an environment that is inclusive through training and just the environment, shifting the environment to a more inclusive environment and culture overall within the organization. So I think the last slide just sort of summarizes some of the key initiatives that we gleaned from the work that we've done, and some of the key initiatives to really helping support and advance diversity, equity, and inclusion within organizations. Really, some of the most effective ones are mentors, creating mentorship programs and helping people really engage in the culture, overcome cultural barriers that may exist, and have somebody that they can go to that helps them deal with some of the challenges that need to be dealt with and explored. Create a culture of inclusion. And then this idea of creating social purpose and always having social purpose out in front so that people really have an appreciation for what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. Expanding the pool. We've mentioned before, looking at non-traditional sources for recruitment. And then this idea of really committing to technology and keeping technology up to date and even ahead of the curve to help recruit and engage younger generation workforce to really get excited about being in the industry. So those are some of the things that came out of it. The entire report is available on the NOCO website, and Adam put that in the chat box, so you can certainly go to that document there. So with that, I'll turn it back to Faisal, and if anyone has any questions or discussions or would like to say, yes, we've seen that, or we have seen something else that we think you've missed, we would love to hear that.
Thank you, Pat. Yes, there are a couple of questions or comments on the chat. I can read it for you. David Jackson, he's saying most federal US DOT IT staff is actually third-party contractors. So wondering if they are looking at a different hiring model. Any thoughts from you, Pat?
That's a really interesting. I'd have to go back and look at the study, because certainly there are IT employees within the federal system, but I don't remember that it's specifically called out third-party contractors in there. So that's an interesting observation. Is there something more, David, that you wanted to say about that in terms of how you think it impacts hiring?
No, I just thought that was an interesting point where they were looking at it. I mean, is it a new organizational flow model or something? But I was just reacting to your point. I thought it was interesting. I wasn't saying you were incorrect. It's just
no, that's fine. No, that's a really good observation. And with that in mind, I'll go back and look at that work.
Pat, we also have a comment from Kevin Haas on the chat. I find that 15% women figure hard to believe. I think many state DOTs have far greater than 15% women in their workforce.
You know, it was interesting. I had that same reaction. And so that's why I mentioned I'm not exactly sure who they included. You know, it may include, if it includes all maintenance workers, if it includes all transit workers, it's really interesting when they say the transport industry. So I looked on their website, and it's not fleshed out a lot. It's a fairly new initiative, so it'd be interesting to go back and I'll certainly go back and dig a little deeper and see if I can find who's included within that figure. But I do know that traditionally, women have been fairly underrepresented in transportation as a whole. I know when I was earlier in my career, somebody provided a statistic, probably 20 some years ago, that ITE percent of membership of women was up to 10%, and I was quite surprised it was so low. So it would be interesting to see exactly who's included in that.
Okay. So those were the two comments on the chat. Please feel free to, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to write it on the chat box. What we can do meanwhile is we can request Adam. There is another one, Pat. Let me read it for you. The restaurant worker you described may be a future DOT technician analyst. I'm hearing we should consider them when looking at work in the future. And this is from Doug Cotto.
Yeah, that's the thing. I don't think we should be limiting ourselves to any industry, traditional or otherwise, in terms of where we recruit. I think one of the advantages of looking at more of a skills-based approach to recruitment and hiring is that we have an opportunity to bring folks in who may be very technically savvy, may be self-taught, may have just grown up with computers, may have a penchant for analytics for whatever reason, but have not necessarily had formal training or a job history that would fall into our traditional recruiting, process. They could easily be eliminated. So one of the challenges I think we have is how do we start looking at ways of expanding the recruitment area through tools, through skills-based tools. So, that's one of those conversations I think transportation TISMO folks can have with the HR folks to really start to get more creative around how can we identify skills and how can we recruit skills. And if they're working in a restaurant now, if they have those skills, I don't really care what their work history is if they can do the job. So I think that's a great example.